and I was really raised as a Scientologist. And when I graduated high school, I joined the C organization, which is Scientology's inner core of most dedicated elite members. It's sort of like the Vatican, I guess, or some very, very hardcore. You sign a billion-year contract and dedicate yourself to achieving the aims of Scientology. And I went initially to join L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, on his boat in the Mediterranean, which was called the Apollo. And Hubbard had left England and was being pursued by various government agencies, and he decided in 1966-67 that he was going to sort of escape government oversight, and he bought 3 ships, and the largest of them was called the Apollo, and he hung out on the Apollo and sailed around in the Mediterranean and then ultimately into the Caribbean. And that was the people from the Apollo in the Caribbean who then moved ashore here to Clearwater in late 1974, early 1975. And I was with Hubbard throughout that time period. And then when we came to Clearwater, or when we came ashore from the Apollo, I was actually one of the very first people that came to the Fort Harrison. I was there when it was still the Jack Tar Hotel before Scientology had taken possession of it.
Wow.
I sort of rose in the ranks of Scientology ultimately to become the international spokesperson for Scientology, on the board of directors of the Church of Scientology International, which is the mother church of Scientology, and the head of what's known as the Office of Special Affairs. And the Office of Special Affairs is a very euphemistic sounding, or very euphemistic name for the department of Scientology that deals with external matters, which includes external threats, which means taking care of the enemies of Scientology.
Right.
And that history, when L. Ron Hubbard died in 1986, there was a sort of a vacuum created. He didn't leave any specific, clear instructions about what was to happen after he croaked, and David Miscavige, the current leader of Scientology, ultimately prevailed in a sort of power struggle and took over and has followed in the footsteps of Hubbard since then. So initially I worked for Hubbard, but then I started working for Miscavige when he took over, and I was, along with another guy called Marty Rathbun, sort of the two people who dealt with all external matters for Scientology. The IRS exemption, dealing with governments, dealing with legal cases, with the media, with all anything that had to do with Scientology's relationship to the world and the difficulties that may be having PR-wise or legal-wise.
Wow. So what was it like being around L. Ron Hubbard? And how old were you at that time?
I was 18 when I first arrived. I just turned 18 when I first arrived on the Apollo with Hubbard. He was a very larger-than-life character. He was a large man, just physically, but he was also had this sort of commanding presence of, you knew when he walked in a room, even if you didn't see him. He was just a big, narcissistic, but somewhat humorous, but crazy. But the enigmas surrounding L. Ron Hubbard are kind of hard to describe. There is a very, very brilliant book written by an English author called Russell Miller that is an unauthorized biography of L. Ron Hubbard. And that book, Barefaced Messiah, is the best insight into the life of Hubbard. Hubbard was at heart, he was a bullshitter. He was a storyteller. He made his living writing fiction works, science fiction, and other sorts of pulp fiction. And he basically took his skill as a writer of fiction and turned it into a money-making proposition as the author of Scientology. And, you know, there are things in Scientology that are that most people would agree with. It's not all nuts.
Right.
Like, there's enough of it that is sort of makes sense and does help some people and is pretty benign and interesting. What's sort of interesting about it is how cleverly it is constructed to have a sort of a face to the world and a presentation to new people that makes it kind of attractive and interesting. And only once you've immersed yourself in it more do you start to see the darker side.
Right.
But
yeah, it seems like it, and at least for face value, it seems like a very productive, get shit done, you know, get rid of the negative influences in your life, and it's a very positive way to, you know, be a better version of yourself in all aspects, at least for face value.
Well, that's what it promotes.
Right.
And like I said, there are aspects to it that are presented to the world that make it appear that way. Mm-hmm. The unfortunate truth is that there is a very dark underbelly to Scientology. And, you know, that's what we really covered in the Aftermath series that Leah Remini and I did. Mm-hmm. And now we are covering on the podcast that we are doing, which is called Scientology Fair Game. And fair game is the real meat of the nasty business of Scientology, because fair game is the policy and practices that were laid out by L. Ron Hubbard to destroy enemies. And Danny, you wouldn't believe the detail that he went into on how you go about doing that. And this is all written in documents that are you know, they're not readily available. They're much more available now. WikiLeaks has got a bunch of them. I've put a bunch of them on my blog. They've sort of leaked out over the years, but these are documents that say basically to harass, intimidate, trick, lie, destroy enemies. And enemies is, I put in quotation marks because in the Scientology or the Hubbard definition of enemy is anybody who disagrees with, questions, opposes, or criticizes Scientology in any way. It's not, you know, you don't have to be an out-and-out criminal to be designated an enemy of Scientology.
Right.
You know, you can just be a person who speaks on TV or does an interview or writes a story. I mean, Tom Tobin and Joe Childs are enemies of Scientology. You know, the reporters from the Tampa Bay Times, in fact, back in the early days of Scientology in Clearwater, there was a reporter for the then St. Pete Times, Betty Orsini, who had exposed the fact that Scientology had purchased the Fort Harrison, because when that was done, it was done under the guise of being a front group called the United Churches of Florida.
Right.
And the Southern Land Development and Leasing Corporation. And it was like she exposed that and she became an enemy, and there was a bunch of things that were done by Scientology to try and destroy her career and her life, get her fired from the St. Pete Times, get her husband to divorce her. I mean, it was like an out-and-out campaign. And there had been campaigns. The mayor of Clearwater at that time, Gabe Cazares, who was also very upset about the fact that nobody had been up front when we first came to Clearwater, became the target of a monumental efforts to destroy him. He was set up in a fake hit-and-run accident at a conference in Washington, D.C. They planted documents in files saying that he was bigamously married to a woman in Mexico. They got students, quote, students who were young women to claim that he was having affairs with them. And this was all documented after the FBI raided Scientology in 1977 in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, and discovered all the documents that laid out these plans to destroy people.
Wow.
And so it's not just, anybody who is considered to be a nuisance to Scientology. They don't just sort of lie down and take it. They go out and actively work to destroy that person and shut them down. And in fact, that was my job as the head of the Office of Special Affairs. My responsibility and what I was judged on in that job was the number of dismissed attackers. That was what you counted, the number of dismissed attackers. And a dismissed attacker is another euphemistic term